2 weeks of pain she never reported, he noticed. The first time Calder Finn noticed something was wrong, he said nothing. He was good at that, at watching without making the watching visible. 14 years in deep station logistics had trained it into him. Read the room, read the manifest, read the person, and keep whatever you concluded behind your teeth until you were sure. Certainty was expensive out here. You didn't spend it on a maybe. So when the new Vithran liaison stepped off the transit pod on a Tuesday and moved through the Bracken station, receiving Doc with a very specific kind of stillness. Not the stillness of composure, which he'd seen plenty of, but the stillness of someone who had decided that not moving was safer than moving. He filed it and said nothing. Her name was Sorvath Ilankar. He'd read the credential packet that morning. 18 years with the Vithran Trade Commission, specialist in mineral rights and extraction contracts, assigned to Bracken Station for the duration of the Iridian Corridor renegotiation, which was estimated at 6 to 8 weeks. Maybe more if the Iridian bloc decided to be difficult about the secondary yield clauses, which in Calder's experience they always did. She was taller than him by about 4 inches, and he wasn't short. Her skin was the color of deep water in low light, a shifting blue-gray that picked up whatever was ambient around her and changed with the light the way water did, so that she was never exactly the same color in the same corridor twice. Her hair was close-cropped and nearly colorless, a white so pale it red silver in the dock lights and almost lavender in the warm sections of the station. She had the secondary eyelid that Vithrans used in high-particulate environments, the membranous inner lid that swept horizontally when she blinked, which he'd read about in the Vithran physiological brief and never seen up close. Her eyes were a very dark amber, not quite brown, not quite gold. Something in between that kept catching the light wrong and being more interesting than he expected. She carried one bag. She signed in with Dock Officer Preddy without ceremony, answered the standard intake questions in precise, accented standard, and asked where her assigned workspace was. Preddy pointed. She thanked him and walked directly there. She didn't wince. She didn't pause. She didn't press her hand to her side or favor one hip over the other or shift her weight in the small telling ways that pain produced. She just moved with that particular, precise stillness, and Calder watched her go down the corridor until she turned the corner, and he went back to his morning manifest and thought, there's something wrong with her left side. He didn't know how he knew. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't Vithran, so he had no baseline for what her body language should normally look like. He knew logistics. He knew weight distribution. He knew the way a person moved when they were managing a load versus not managing one. The way carrying something heavy changed a person's gait. The way an injury rerouted movement along small, unconscious detours. And there was something about the way Sorvath Ilankar's left shoulder sat, fractionally higher than the right, fractionally rigid in a way that didn't match the easy precision of everything else about her, that looked less like her natural posture, and more like a conscious decision about her natural posture. He filed it, he said nothing. His office was 2 corridors from the primary negotiation suite, because the primary negotiation suite needed constant logistical support, and he'd learned 14 years ago that 2 corridors was close enough to respond quickly and far enough to avoid being pulled into every procedural argument about meeting room temperature or the appropriate height of the refreshment table. Deep station negotiations were full of those arguments. He'd stopped being surprised by them sometime around year 4. He saw Sorvath Ilankar every morning when the commission delegation arrived for the day's session. He saw her at lunch, when the delegates filtered into the common room and he happened to be passing through on his necessary route to the environmental monitoring station at the end of the corridor. He saw her a few evenings when the session ran late, and she was still in the prep room adjacent to the negotiation suite, working through her documents when he made his end-of-day rounds. He watched her the way he watched everything, without making the watching obvious. His attention was broad and constant, and had been since he was 24 and first managing inventory on a freight run, learning to hold 20 different variables simultaneously and notice when any one of them shifted. He watched the air recyclers and the structural load on the secondary docking ring and the resupply margins and the behavioral patterns of 87 permanent station residents and a rotating roster of visitors. He watched Sorvath Ilankar in exactly the same way he watched all of it, continuously, without emphasis, adding each observation to everything else. What he saw over the first 3 days was this. She was very, very good at her job. She asked clear questions and expected clear answers, and if the answers weren't clear, she waited with a patience that managed to imply, without any overt pressure, that she would continue waiting until they were. She had no tolerance for procedural delay that was actually avoidance, and considerable tolerance for substantive complexity that was actually complex. She knew the difference, and everyone in the room with her knew that she knew. She read the room by letting it talk and listening with her whole attention, and her counterarguments arrived precisely calibrated, not a word wasted. And she was in pain. He could see it more clearly with every day. Not dramatically, she didn't grimace or flinch or make any of the sounds a person in pain might make. She was too controlled for that. It was subtler than that, woven into the fabric of how she occupied space. The economy of her movements, the way she never made a gesture that wasn't necessary, never extended herself beyond what a given action required, as though her body had silently agreed with itself to reduce expenditure. The way she always chose a seat with her left side toward the wall. The way she never twisted at the waist if she could turn her whole body instead, rotating on the pivot of her hips in a motion that was fractionally more effortful and kept her torso from rotating at all. The way she picked things up off lower surfaces with her right hand exclusively, even when the angle was awkward, even when reaching across with the left would have been faster and easier. The way she set her water glass back on the table with a care that was barely visible but unmistakably there, not wanting to jar herself. And the breathing. He came back to the breathing again and again, because it was the thing that told him this wasn't mild or manageable in the way she was managing it. She breathed slightly shallower than the air quality warranted. He knew exactly what the air quality warranted because he was responsible for it, and he cross-checked it every morning. The air in the negotiation corridor was at a standard a healthy person at rest could breathe deeply with no effort. She was not breathing deeply. She was rationing it, keeping her rib expansion small and controlled, and the only reason a person did that was because expansion hurt. On the 4th day, he ran a very quiet query through the station's medical intake database. Not her records, those were restricted, and he had no clearance and no legitimate reason to access them. Just the intake log, the transit pod she'd arrived on, whether she'd visited medical since arriving. She had not visited medical since arriving. He thought about that for a while. He thought about the shoulder and the breathing and the way she reached across with her right hand. He went back to his manifest. On the 5th day, she had a prolonged exchange with the Iridian Block's documentation officer. A dry, technical argument about the indexing format of the secondary yield tables that went on for most of the morning session, and was, by all accounts from Preddy, intensely specific. Calder was in and out of the corridor 3 times on environmental checks. Each time he passed the suite window he could see her at the table, sitting with that precise economy, making her case in the particular way she made all her cases, without visible effort, without audible strain, with the patience of someone who understood that thoroughness was its own form of pressure. He noticed, on the 3rd pass, that she'd been in the same position for nearly 4 hours. The left shoulder had climbed, not dramatically, a centimeter, maybe 2, in the upward drift that happened when the muscles trying to protect an injury tired of the effort and started compensating with rigidity instead. He'd seen it happen with humans carrying unacknowledged strains. He'd seen it in his own body, years ago, after a freight bay accident he'd managed alone for longer than he should have. He went back to his office and noted the resupply authorization and didn't think about what he was going to do yet. He spent a portion of the fifth evening in the station library's species reference section, which was not something he did often. The library was a small room off the main corridor, 3 terminals and a reading stand, maintained largely for the negotiating delegations who passed through and occasionally needed to research their counterparts. He used the terminal in the corner and pulled the Vithran physiological reference, the same brief he'd skimmed when the commission delegation was confirmed, now read more carefully. The relevant section was on the Vithran nervous system. He read it twice. Vithrans had a different pain threshold calibration than humans. Not dramatically different, not the kind of thing you'd read about in popular science and find astonishing. Just shifted. Their nociceptive response, the brief explained, was calibrated to a higher baseline stimulus, meaning that a level of tissue damage that a human nervous system would flag as significant might register to a Vithran as present but not urgent. The evolutionary logic was reasonable. The Vithran home world had a high-activity ecology. The species had developed in an environment that required sustained physical activity through the kind of minor damage that was essentially constant in that context. The practical result, the brief noted, was that Vithran individuals often underestimated the severity of soft tissue injuries and overestimated their own functional capacity when injured. He also read the section on Vithran professional culture as it applied to off-world service. The Trade Commission had its own additional layer. Presentation mattered. Appearing strong and capable and unimpaired was not merely personal preference but professional standard, especially during active negotiation. Appearing impaired in front of an opposing party was considered a significant tactical disadvantage. Appearing impaired in front of the neutral facilitating station was considered a vulnerability that could be exploited by either party. He turned these pieces over together for a while. High pain threshold, professional culture that treated visible impairment as a liability, something clearly wrong with her left side, nearly a week on the station without visiting medical. He didn't like where that math went. He went back to his manifest and did his job and thought about it in the background, the way he thought about most things that required time to resolve. On the 6th day, one of the junior members of the commission delegation, a young specialist named Torvin, on what appeared to be his first off-world assignment, caught his shoulder on the edge of the prep room doorframe and made a sound about it that carried into the corridor. Not a serious injury. A glancing blow, the kind that stung and was forgotten in 10 minutes. Sorvith Ilankar, who was 4 steps behind him in the corridor at the time, looked at the doorframe, looked at the young specialist, and said something brief in Vithran that Calder didn't catch. Then she walked through the doorway herself, left shoulder angled away from the frame by a margin that was wider than the door required. Calder, who was at the corridor junction 15 feet away, reviewing an equipment request on his tablet, saw it. He went back to his tablet. He noted the equipment request. He thought, with a kind of settled clarity, that he had now been watching this for 6 days and was not going to reach any different conclusion on day 7 than he'd reached on day 3. On the 7th day, the afternoon session overran. He knew it was overrunning because Preddy sent him a message at the standard end-of-session time, saying the catering order for the dinner extension should be put through, which happened when a session was going to run past 7. He put the order through and thought nothing more about it until 8:30, when he was finishing the last of his maintenance logs and the negotiation suite corridor was still lit. Voices still audible, not the words, just the ongoing quality of a conversation that wasn't finished. He walked the corridor on his end-of-day check at 9. By that point the voices had stopped and the suite lights were out, but the prep room light was still on. He could see it under the door. He didn't knock. He had no reason to knock. He did his corridor check and went back to his office. At 9:45 the prep room light went out. He was at his desk finishing his reports when he heard the quiet of her footsteps going toward the guest quarters, and he thought about 8 hours of active negotiation with an intercostal soft tissue injury, and thought about the word Maya had used, aggravated asterisk, the clean clinical word for what happened when healing got disrupted by continued use, and finished his reports and shut off his light and went to his own quarters and lay in the dark for a while before he slept. On the 8th day, he adjusted the prep room furniture. It was the 9th day when he saw her sit in the adjusted chair, when the left shoulder dropped that fraction, when she exhaled once, quietly. He filed it. He said nothing. But he did, that evening, go back to the station library and look up the relevant section of the Neutral Facilitation Treaty, because he had told himself he wasn't going to say anything until he knew what the stakes were, and he had been to Maya, but he hadn't yet checked the article, and he wanted to have the complete picture before anything moved. Article 9, subsection 3. He read it twice and committed the key language to memory. He closed the terminal and went back to his office and thought, 2 more days, and then I'll say something. That was the deal he made with himself, not indefinitely. 2 more days to be certain and then certainty spent. He was a logistics coordinator. He ran on data and patience, and the kind of discipline that let him hold a problem in his peripheral attention for as long as it needed to be held, without crowding it or rushing it or making it something it wasn't yet. But he also knew the other side of that skill, the side that tipped into avoidance if you let it, the side that kept not acting because there was always a reason to wait 1 more day. He'd had 12 days. He knew what he was looking at. He would not make it 13. He didn't like where that math went. He went back to his manifest and did his job and thought about it in the background, the way he thought about most things that required time to resolve. By the end of the first week, he had a working theory and a growing sense that the first week had not been the last opportunity to act on it. He watched her walk out of the Tuesday session and thought about the 6 weeks minimum that remained, and thought about the breathing pattern, and thought about the high pain threshold, about how a person with a shifted baseline might not perceive their own injury as urgent even as the injury became something that required urgency, and decided on the 9th day to do something he told himself was administrative. He went to the prep room before the morning session and adjusted the ergonomic profile of the workspace furniture. This was, technically, something he should have done when she arrived. The furniture in the prep room defaulted to a blended human Kethani profile, because the previous 2 long-term occupants had been Kethani specialists, and no one had reset it when the commission delegation was confirmed. He'd noted it on his day 1 list and gotten pulled immediately into a resupply dispute with the Iridian Blocks equipment coordinator, who was a persistent man with strong opinions about coolant specifications. He reset it now. He adjusted the seat height, the lumbar support, the desk incline, and the angle of the secondary monitor to Vithran standard specifications, which he pulled from the Commission's own posted ergonomic guidelines. Standard. Correct. Something he should have done 8 days ago. He did not tell her he'd done it. He was nearly finished with the calibration check when she arrived in the morning. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the workspace with the focused attention she gave most things, and then she looked at him. "You changed it," she said. "Should have been set correctly when you arrived," he said. "Sorry about the delay." She studied him for a moment with those amber eyes. The secondary eyelid swept once, the way it did when she was focusing, that slow horizontal sweep that he'd been noticing more clearly as the days accumulated. "Thank you," she said. "Standard," he said, and collected his tools and left. He didn't watch her sit down. He noted from his peripheral vision as he moved toward the door that she sat differently than she had the day before. Not dramatically. Just with slightly less deliberation, as though the calculations required by the chair had shifted and some of them no longer needed solving. He saw her left shoulder drop a fraction, just a fraction, but it dropped. He went to his office and did his work. On day 10, the environmental team flagged a pressure variance in the negotiation suite's ventilation system, minor, within acceptable parameters, but the kind of thing that would drift outside parameters in another 48 hours if he left it. He went to investigate and ended up spending most of the morning in and around the suite's mechanical access corridor, which ran parallel to the prep room on the opposite side of the insulated wall. He couldn't hear the session through the insulated walls. He could hear faintly through the mechanical access panel. When the session recessed at midday, the change in ambient sound that meant the room had opened, the shift from contained silence to dispersal. He heard footsteps. He heard voices in several different languages, overlapping, the way multilingual delegations always sounded in the corridor during a break, everyone code switching to the fastest available channel. He heard pressed. He didn't hear the words clearly. The mechanical access corridor was not designed for eavesdropping, and the Iridian block's lead negotiator was in the main corridor while Calder was behind a panel 20 feet away. But he heard the tone, which was carrying and deliberate in the specific way of a person who was making sure they were audible without appearing to be making sure. He heard the laughter that followed it from the two Iridian specialists flanking Prast, the short social laugh of people responding to their senior rather than to something genuinely funny. And he heard the word for asterisk injured in Iridian Standard, a word he'd learned early in his logistics career, because freight coordinators needed to know it in several languages for cargo documentation and incident reporting, and it was phonemically distinct enough that it cut through both the acoustic insulation and the ambient noise. He finished the pressure adjustment he was working on. It took 7 minutes from that point. He did it with complete attention, because incomplete attention on a pressure system was how you got variance that became a problem instead of variance that got fixed. Then he replaced the access panel and walked to the corridor. Through the window of the prep room, he could see her at her desk, documents open, tablet to one side, expression exactly as composed as it always was, that particular, precise neutrality that he'd been reading for 10 days and had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but the controlled management of it. The same skill she used in session. The same skill she'd been using all morning and would use all afternoon and would use for as many weeks as this negotiation required. She gave no sign that she had heard anything. He went to his desk. He thought about what it meant to hear something like that and give no sign and keep going. He thought about how many times a person would need to practice that, not in preparation for it, but in repetition of it, because situations like that didn't happen once, before it looked as natural as it had looked on her face through the prep room window. He thought about the negotiation, about yield clauses and 6 more weeks minimum of sitting across a table from a man who had noticed what she was carrying and had decided to use it as a weapon. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, and by the end of it, he decided that the prep room adjustments he'd made on day 9 were not enough. On day 12, he went to see Dr. Maya Halst. He didn't say why. He said he had a hypothetical. Maya looked at him over her coffee. She was always on her second cup by the time he stopped by, because medical ran earlier shifts than operations, and said she charged extra for hypotheticals that took more than 5 minutes, and he said he'd keep it brief. Vithran, he said, left side nearly 2 weeks, not reporting. Maya set down her coffee with a particular kind of care that meant she was paying attention. What kind of not reporting? Not reporting to me, or not reporting to their own people? Not reporting to you. I don't know about their own people. What makes you think something's wrong? Movement pattern, breathing, posture, left shoulder consistently high and fixed, no waist rotation, full body pivoting instead. Right hand preference for anything below hip height, even when the left hand would be more efficient. Shallow breath pattern inconsistent with current air quality. Maya was quiet for a moment. Her expression was the one she wore when she was running something through and deciding how much to say about it. That's a very specific set of observations for a logistics coordinator. I watch things, he said. You do? She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Hypothetically, if that pattern is what I think it is, rib stress, could be a fracture, could be a deep bruise, could be a soft tissue tear in the intercostal muscles. You can't tell from movement alone. She paused. Vithrin rib structure is different from human. They have 2 layers of floating ribs on the left side, and the lower set is more vulnerable than ours because the musculature attaches differently. The supporting tissue is less anchored. Is it serious if it's a tear? Depends on how long it's been untreated and how much the affected area has been used in the interim. A partial tear that gets consistently aggravated over 2 weeks, she paused, can become a complete tear. And a complete tear in that area is a 6-week minimum recovery, possible surgical intervention, and in the short term a real risk of secondary complications if it tears during high exertion activity. She looked at him steadily. Hypothetically. Yes, he said. Hypothetically. Vithrins don't come to me voluntarily during active negotiations, she said. In my experience, there's a cultural piece about it that I've run into before. Showing physical impairment during an active engagement is considered a liability. They'd rather manage it themselves. Even if managing it themselves is making it worse. Even then, she turned the cup again, so what's your hypothetical plan? He thought about it for a moment. I don't have one fully formed yet. Let me know when you do, she said. Because hypothetically, 2 weeks untreated soft tissue damage with continued high-activity use is the kind of thing that stops being manageable on its own and starts being a medical event. And medical events in the middle of a corridor renegotiation are the kind of thing that derails negotiations and generates a lot of paperwork that I do not enjoy. He thanked her and left. He thought about it for the rest of that day. He thought about his lane and about the things that were in it and the things that were not. He thought about *Vethsoren. He didn't know the word yet, but he thought about the thing it described, attending to what someone needs before they have named it, about whether that was something a logistics coordinator was permitted to do for a trade commission specialist who was not his responsibility and had not asked for his attention. He thought about Prast's voice in the corridor, about the word for *injured and the laughter that followed it. He thought about 11 days of watching her manage something alone that she should not have been managing alone, and about the fact that no one else on the station had said anything to him about it, not because they hadn't noticed, but because it wasn't their problem and they'd decided to keep it that way. And he thought about how that was, in its own way, a kind of decision too. The decision to not notice. The decision to file and move on and let the person carry whatever they were carrying without interruption. He had never been good at that particular decision. He'd tried it at various points in his career. It had never sat right. The manifest said what things were supposed to weigh, and when something was heavier than it should be, the discrepancy stayed visible to him regardless of whether it was his official problem. She was heavier than she should be. That was the only way he knew how to say it internally. The weight of 2 weeks of managed pain and an active negotiation, and a man across the table who had noticed and was using it. That was a load that was past what one person should be expected to carry without anyone else acknowledging it existed. He could not fix the negotiation. He could not address Prast. He could not make the injury not have happened. He could not do any of the things that were not in his lane. What was in his lane was the station, the environment, the resources in stores. The question of what a person needed, and whether those things were available and correctly positioned. He went back to the prep room that evening, after the delegation had left for the day. He spent 40 minutes in there. He raised the height of the secondary work surface by 3 centimeters and angled it toward the right, so that documents on the left side of the surface were accessible from a position that didn't require the left arm to extend. He replaced the standard issue chair with a Vithrin anatomical support model from the equipment store. the kind with the lateral ribcage support integrated into the left backrest, which was in the Commission's own posted standard equipment list for veteran personnel who spent long hours at a desk, but which no one had thought to requisition when the workspace was set up. He adjusted the lighting. The overhead angle had been casting a mild glare on the secondary monitor, which produced a compensatory head position that tightened the neck and shoulder on the same side as the injury. He moved the most frequently accessed physical reference files to the right side of the workspace so she wouldn't need to reach left for them. None of it was treatment, he knew that. None of it fixed what was wrong, but all of it reduced the number of small movements that aggravated soft tissue damage, reduced the load on her left side, made the environment incrementally easier to inhabit for 8 hours at a stretch without compounding what was already there. It was the best he could do within his lane. He was checking his work when he heard the quiet in the corridor that was her footsteps. He turned around and she was in the doorway. She was still in her commission formal, the structured dark gray with the silver trade insignia at the left collar, which she'd been wearing all day in session. Her tablet was under her right arm. She had clearly come back for something she'd left, and she was standing with the particular stillness she always stood with, but looking at him, not at the room, with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the professional composure, not the focused assessment she deployed when she was listening to an argument she was deciding how to answer. Something else, something that asked a question it hadn't quite formed into words yet. He looked at what he was doing and then at her and said, honestly, the support model was in stores. It should have been requisitioned when you arrived. She looked at the chair. She looked at the adjusted work surface, the repositioned files, the changed lighting angle. She did it methodically, the way she did everything, taking inventory before she spoke. Then she looked at him. "What do you think is wrong with me?" she said. The question was direct. He'd noticed over 12 days that she asked direct questions. She didn't approach them sideways or dress them in softening language. She asked what she wanted to know in the most efficient phrasing available. He respected that. He answered the same way. "I think you have a soft tissue injury on your left side, probably rib area, based on how you've been moving and breathing. I think you've had it since before you arrived here, because nothing on this station could have caused it, and you were already managing it on day one." He met her eyes steadily. "I think you haven't reported it because you're in the middle of a negotiation and Prast is the kind of man who would use any information about the opposing party that he could get his hands on, and you're not willing to give him anything." He paused. "I think you've been managing it alone for 2 weeks, and I think it's getting worse, not better." The silence in the prep room was complete. The environmental system hummed at the precise decibel level he maintained. Through the narrow porthole at the far end of the room, the black of space was absolute and unmoving. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he became aware of how specific and uncomfortable a thing he'd just said, how much observation it had required to say it, how visible that observation now was. "You've been watching me," she said. Her voice was even, not accusatory, just noting a fact. "I watch everything," he said. "It's my job, the air recyclers, the structural load on the secondary docking ring, the resupply margins, the 87 people on this station and how they move through it and what they need to keep moving through it." He paused. "I noticed." Another silence. Her secondary eyelid swept once slowly. "Prast noticed too," she said. "He said the word for asterisk injured in Iridian Standard during the midday recess, loudly enough to be heard." "I know," he said. "I was in the maintenance corridor, I heard him." Something moved across her face, not pain, exactly, but related to it. The look of a person confronting the cost of something they had decided to bear alone. "And you didn't say anything." "It wasn't my conversation to enter. I'm logistics, not diplomacy." He looked at the room, the chair, the repositioned surface, the changed light angle. "What I can do is this, and ask you to see Dr. Halst." She was very still for a moment. If I visit the station's medical facility during an active negotiation session. Maya doesn't report to the delegations, he said. She reports to the station commander, and station medical records are not accessible to negotiating parties under any circumstances by treaty. He held her gaze. Prast can guess whatever he wants. He cannot see your medical record. He cannot confirm anything. What he has is an implication and your ability to continue working. Visiting medical doesn't change the second of those things. It protects it. She looked at him. The amber was very steady in her eyes. You've thought about this for longer than tonight, she said. I've thought about it for several days, he said. Since when? Since approximately day 4, he said. She absorbed that. 4 days and you thought something was wrong, and you waited 8 more days before saying it. I waited until I knew what I was looking at and what could be done about it, he said. Saying something on day 4 would have been a guess. I don't spend guesses on people. The expression on her face shifted again, something moving through it that he couldn't quite name. That is a very careful way to care about something, she said. He didn't answer that directly. Will you see Dr. Halst? She was quiet for a long moment, not reluctant, he thought, thinking. Yes, she said. She went to see Maya the next morning. He knew because Maya sent him a message that said hypothetical resolved and nothing else. He read it, acknowledged it, filed it, went back to his morning manifest. He didn't ask what the outcome was. It wasn't his information. What he did notice, because he noticed things, was that on day 13, she came through the receiving corridor 15 minutes later than usual, walking from the direction of the medical bay. She arrived for the morning session at exactly her normal time, which meant she had calibrated the detour precisely. He thought that was very like her. And he noticed, through the window of his office as the delegation passed, that she walked differently. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who wasn't watching for it would see, but the shoulder was level with the right. The breathing, when she passed close enough for him to observe it through the glass, was fuller. When she turned at the corridor junction to look at something Preddy was handing her, she turned at the waist. He went back to his manifest and noted the resupply authorization and thought, quietly, that 14 years of watching things had occasionally produced a good outcome. She found him at his desk at the end of day 13. He was reviewing the week's allocation numbers, which were not complicated but required careful attention to the balance between current usage and the margin he maintained against unplanned need. He heard footsteps in the outer corridor, the particular quiet of them, and looked up. She was still in her commission formal. She had a tablet tucked under her right arm, and she stood in the doorway of his office with the composed directness she always stood with, but she was not in a session, and there was nothing about her posture that was performing composure. She just looked like herself. Maya said it was a partial tear, she said without preamble. In the intercostal tissue, lower left, the second floating layer. She said if I had left it another week without treatment, the repeated stress of the session work would likely have converted it to a complete tear. He put down his stylus. I'm glad you went. She also said, Sorvith Ilankar continued carefully, that someone had consulted with her about Vithran's soft tissue injury mechanics in a hypothetical context approximately 24 hours before I presented. He looked at her steadily. Did she? She did. She studied him with the amber steadiness that he'd stopped trying to read and had started simply accepting as her face, thinking. You went to her before you spoke to me. I needed to know what I was looking at before I said anything, including what the stakes were if I was right. Why, she said. Why did the stakes matter to you before you'd said anything? The question was simple and direct, and was the same kind of question she had been asking people all week in the negotiation suite, the kind that looked simple and was actually the one that cut to the center of the thing. He thought about how to answer it the same way. Because if I was wrong, he said, I would have said something unnecessary and uncomfortable to someone who had not asked for my attention and had no reason to want it. I didn't want to do that without being sure. He paused. And because if I was right, I needed to understand what the options were before I brought it to you, so that I could say something useful, instead of something that only added a problem to the one you already had. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than most of her pauses. That is a very particular way to think about another person's situation, she said. It's how I think about most problems, he said. Know what you're working with before you say what you're going to do about it. Most people, she said, don't apply that level of consideration to problems that are not their own. You were on my station, he said. That makes it somewhat mine. She looked at him with those amber eyes in the long way. That is a generous definition of professional responsibility. He looked back at her steadily. Maybe. Something moved across her face again, the thing he'd been catching glimpses of all week without being quite able to name it. Maya also said, she added, that you were, and I am quoting her directly, obscenely observant for someone who claims to just work in logistics. A brief pause. I found myself unable to disagree. He almost smiled. He let it reach his eyes instead of his face, which was typically what he did with it. I'll take it. She also confirmed, Sorvith-Ilankar said, that my records cannot be accessed by the delegations. That was not something I had verified. I had assumed it was true, but I had not verified it. It's in the Neutral Facilitation Treaty, he said. Article 9, subsection 3. I looked it up after we spoke. The secondary eyelid swept once. You looked it up after we spoke. To be sure, I'd told you correctly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, You are a very unusual person, Calder Finn. I'm a logistics coordinator, he said. You are a logistics coordinator, she said, with a patience that was not quite humor and not quite exasperation, and was something between the two, who spent 12 days observing me with enough accuracy to catalog a soft tissue injury, then spent his own time reconfiguring my workspace to reduce the load on that injury, then consulted your medical officer, then researched the specific treaty article that protected my confidentiality, and then told me all of it in a single conversation without requiring anything from me in return. She paused. That is not logistics, that is something else. He thought about that for a moment. It needed doing, he said. You weren't going to do it yourself. And it was getting worse. The last two words came out slightly differently than the rest, and he was aware of it. He was aware of the fact that getting worse was not the same as the clinical language he'd been using for the rest of the conversation. She seemed to hear it too. Yes, she said, it was. On day 14, Prast made his move. Calder heard about it secondhand, from Pretty, who was at his station outside the negotiation suite, and heard the raised voices. Prast had requested a formal session record addendum, noting that the Commission's lead negotiator had visited the station's medical facility during an active negotiation period, which he was attempting to enter as evidence of impaired negotiating capacity. By the time Calder heard about it, the matter had already been resolved. Sorvith-Ilankar had submitted documentation from Maya, a brief standard medical clearance confirming that the Commission's lead negotiator was under treatment for a resolved pre-existing injury and was fully capable of conducting her professional duties, along with a citation of the Neutral Facilitation Treaty article that made Prast's addendum request procedurally invalid. He heard the session resume 20 minutes later. He heard, from Pretty's very satisfied account, that Prast had been notably quieter for the remainder of the afternoon. He was passing the prep room at the end of the day when she came out of it. I heard about the session, he said. Prast attempted a procedural maneuver, she said. It failed. The documentation was sufficient and the treaty citation was not one he'd anticipated. A brief pause. He should have. He didn't do his preparation, Calder said. He rarely does. He relies on a capacity for intimidation that functions only when the opposing party is intimidated. She looked at him steadily. I was not. No, he said, I didn't think you would be. She studied him. You submitted the treaty article to me last night. I mentioned the article. You found the citation. Yes, she said, I did. A small pause that had something different in it than her usual pauses. I find I am in the habit of finding things more quickly when someone tells me where to look. He looked at her, she looked at him. The corridor was quiet at this hour, the day shift winding down, the particular hush of a station settling into its evening rhythm. There's a Vithran dish on the common room menu, he said. The night cook added it when the commission delegation's rotation extended. I don't know if you've had the chance to try it. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. I have not had dinner, she said. Neither have I, he said, if you want. She looked at him with the careful, accurate look she gave everything she was deciding whether to trust, and he waited while she decided. Yes, she said, all right. He learned things at dinner that the credential packet hadn't told him. She had negotiated mineral rights on 7 different stations and 2 planetary surfaces, and she said the work had taken her far enough from Vithran space that she had become, as she put it, approximately fluent in the experience of being somewhere that was not built for you. She said it without self-pity, the same way she said most things, as a fact she'd observed and filed. He said he understood that. He'd spent 6 years on freight runs before finding his way to station logistics, and he'd spent most of those 6 years being the person who wasn't from anywhere the ship was going and wasn't staying when it left. What made you stay? She said. He thought about it. It wasn't a question he'd been asked often. Most people assumed the answer was the salary, or the stability, or the reduced transit hours, and any of those could have served as an answer. But they weren't the actual answer. The ability to know something well enough to maintain it, he said. On a run, you're always moving through, you understand the surface of places. You get very good at reading them quickly because you only have a limited time in them before you leave and it doesn't matter anymore. He turned his coffee cup slowly. I wanted to know something fully, what it needed, what kept it running, how all the pieces connected and what happened when any of them shifted. A pause. There's a satisfaction in making something work that I don't think you can get from passing through. You have to stay in a thing to know whether you actually fixed it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. That is not how most people describe logistics work, she said. Most people describe it as inventory management, he said, which is also true, but the inventory is secondary to the question of what keeps the thing running. The thing being the station. The thing being whatever I'm responsible for, he said. Right now, yes, the station. She considered that, and the people in it. He looked at her. Yes, he said, and the people in it. She nodded, once, the small, precise nod she used when she accepted a point. You are describing a kind of stewardship, she said. I suppose, he said, yes. My mother used a word for that, she said. Veth Soren. It is not precisely translatable. It means attending to what something or someone needs before they have named the need, the attending itself, the accuracy of it. She looked at him. She used it for her garden. She would watch the plants and read what they required before they showed the obvious signs, before the leaves changed color or the stems bent. She said the garden told you things in smaller ways first, if you paid attention. And if you paid attention, he said, you could address the need before it became a failure. Yes, she said, exactly. A pause. She would have used the same word for what you did. He didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't good at receiving that kind of thing directly. He was better at doing the thing than at being told he'd done it. 12 days, she said. 11 before Maya. You said you don't spend certainty on a maybe. I don't. Most people would have said something on day 1 and been wrong, or said nothing at all. She looked at him with a directness that he was beginning to understand, just how she looked at things she was taking seriously. You watched until you were sure, and then you moved. I try not to complicate things unnecessarily, he said. That, she said, is the most understated description of what you did that I can imagine. He almost smiled. I work in logistics, he said. Understatement is a professional skill. She did smile. He noticed with some attention that her smile was the same as her humor, dry and precise and brief, but completely real. Not a performance, just her. They finished dinner slowly. The common room quieted around them, the night shift moving through on their routes with the efficiency of people who'd learned to be unobtrusive. Through the porthole at the far end of the room, the Iridian relay station was a small, warm point in the black, close enough to be visible, far enough to be abstract. He knew its specs by this point. He'd coordinated with their freight team twice this month and had the platform's maintenance schedules in his secondary files. He watched it for a moment and thought about how different this was from the freight runs, where you arrived at something and learned it in transit and left it behind before you'd understood it fully, and how he hadn't once regretted the choice to stop moving. 6 more weeks, she said. Minimum, he said. The secondary yield clauses. She shook her head slightly, a small motion precise, the kind that conveyed opinion without waste. The Iridian bloc has established a position they know is not defensible in the long term, but they will not retreat from it until they can construct a narrative that frames the retreat as something other than a retreat. That is a slower process than the actual negotiation. How long, he said. For a bloc with their particular relationship to public position, more than 6 weeks. A pause, possibly 10, possibly 12. He looked at her. Is that a problem for you? She considered the question. He'd noticed over the 2 weeks that she didn't rush her answers to questions she was taking seriously. She gave them the same attention she gave everything, the full amount, not the polite abbreviated version. No, she said, I find it is not. Good, he said. She looked at him across the table, across the quiet plates and the evening air and the station moving through its nighttime rhythms around them, and her expression had settled in a way that was different from the professional composure he'd been watching for 2 weeks. Not softer, exactly. Easier. The specific ease of a person who had put something down that they had been carrying for longer than they'd acknowledged. You have been at this station for how long? She said. 9 years, he said. 9 years, she repeated, in one place. Yes. And before that 6 years of freight runs. She turned her drink in her hands. That is a significant change. It was, he said. I didn't fully understand how significant until I'd been here long enough to know the difference. What was the difference? He thought about it honestly. On the runs, I knew how to leave things. That was the skill, learning a place fast and not expecting it to matter once you were gone. I was good at it. He looked at his coffee. Here I had to learn how to not leave. How to stay with something long enough for the staying to be worth something. He paused. It took longer to learn than the leaving did. She was quiet for a moment. My work has always required moving, she said, station to station, one negotiation then the next. I am efficient at the surfaces of places. A pause that was slightly longer than her usual pauses. I had not considered what it would be like to be somewhere long enough for it to know me. He looked at her. Is that what's happening? She looked back, amber eyes in the warm evening light, steady and entirely direct. I believe, she said carefully, that something is. He didn't say anything to that. He wasn't the kind of person who rushed the things that didn't need rushing. He'd been a logistics coordinator long enough to know that the best outcomes were the ones you didn't force to a conclusion before they were ready. He finished his coffee. She finished her infusion. The common room was quiet and warm around them, and the station did what it always did, held, maintained, provided exactly what was needed. Calder Fen, she said. Yes. Thank you for all of it, she paused. My people have a custom: you don't thank the same person twice for the same act. It implies the first gratitude was insufficient. Another pause. I find that I do not at this moment care about that particular custom. He looked at her, at the amber of her eyes in the warm evening light, at the shoulder that was level, at the easy breath she took and didn't have to ration. Sorvith Ilankar, he said. Yes. You have 10 weeks here, possibly more. Possibly more, she said. If you need anything, he said, logistically or otherwise. She looked at him with the full, careful attention she gave things she was deciding whether to trust, and this time the decision was faster, or maybe just more certain. I will, she said. Calder Fen, she said. Yes. Thank you for all of it, she paused. My people have a custom: you don't thank the same person twice for the same act. It implies the first gratitude was insufficient. Another pause. I find that I do not, at this moment, care about that particular custom. He looked at her, at the amber of her eyes in the warm evening light, at the shoulder that was level, at the easy breath she took and didn't have to ration. Sorvith Ilankar, he said. Yes. You have 10 weeks here, possibly more. Possibly more, she said. If you need anything, he said, logistically or otherwise. She looked at him with the full, careful attention she gave things she was deciding whether to trust, and this time the decision was faster, or maybe just more certain. I will, she said. He walked back to his office after. He did his end-of-shift report. He filed his maintenance notes in the precise order he always filed them. He turned off the light and walked the corridor to his quarters and thought about a word in a language he didn't speak that meant attending to what something needs before it has named the need, and about a garden, and about his mother's explanation of *Vethsoren*, and about the specific quality of amber eyes that found the light and kept being more interesting than expected. He thought about 10 weeks and possibly more. He went to sleep. In the morning, he went back to work. He checked the air quality, correct, as it always was. He checked the structural load on the secondary docking ring, within tolerance, the small variance he'd been monitoring holding steady. He reviewed the resupply authorization, and signed off on the equipment requests, and answered 17 administrative messages, and drafted a response to the Iridian Freight Coordinator about the coolant specifications, which remained a point of contention and probably would for the foreseeable future. The commission delegation arrived at their standard time. He heard them from his office, footsteps in the corridor, voices, the sound of the prep room door, and then the negotiation suite door opening and closing. He was on his third manifest item when he heard footsteps that were quieter than the others. He looked up. She walked past the window of his office on her way to the negotiation suite, shoulders level, breathing easy. Stride natural and unguarded, none of the precise economy of a person managing a load. She looked like herself, fully, without the overhead of 2 weeks of invisible calculation. She didn't stop. She had a session to get to and he had a resupply to finalize. But she turned her head as she passed and looked through the window, and her eyes found his, and she held the look for one deliberate moment, long enough to be intentional, brief enough to be exactly what it was. An acknowledgement, one careful person to another. Then she walked on, and the corridor was empty, and the station hummed around him in all its familiar registers. The environmental system, the pressure variance monitoring, the freight bay indicators, the 87 lives going about their day inside the walls he maintained. Calder Fen sat at his desk and thought about 10 weeks, minimum, and about what Vethsoren * really meant. Not just tending to what a thing needs, but the attending itself, the accuracy of it, the sustained watching that made it possible to act at the right moment, and the satisfaction of making something work that you could only find if you were willing to stay. He went back to his manifest. He was very good at his job. And he was, it turned out, very glad to be staying.